Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Towards the end of Aristotle's Poetics, at least in the form that we currently possess the text, there's a very interesting section that is devoted to discussion of what Aristotle calls problems and solutions. In Greek, problemata and luseis. And problemata are indeed problems, but it's got a kind of resonance in ancient times. It means like difficulties or criticisms that could be made. And then solutions, luseis, literally they're unbinding or they're dissolving. So Aristotle is concerned with issues that can be raised about poetic texts, whether epic or comedic or tragic. And so he's going to bring up a number of considerations that are really quite helpful to take a look at. And he's going to begin this by saying, with problems and solutions, the following considerations will help clarify their number, how many of them, ekposon, and the types, the kaipoion, adon, right? So adon is types, poion, what kind of types there are. And so at one point he's actually going to talk about 12 different things, but it's unclear how many there actually are. It depends on how we associate them. And he tells us, since the poet, like a painter or any other image maker, is a mimetic artist, he must represent one of three kinds of things. So one of these would be the kinds of things that were or are, right? And, you might say, oh, well, so he's a truth teller. He's only talking about things that we actually know to be the case. That's not exactly it. He might be lifting it from somebody else's story and then treating it a certain way. And then the second thing is the kinds of things that people will say or think, or things that literally appear to them. Hoia fasin, that's the things that they say. Kaidoke, right? How things appear. And then the third thing is very interesting. The kind of things that ought to be the case, but actually aren't the case. So he says that these are conveyed in a diction, which includes a bunch of things that we allow poets, loanwords, metaphors, and we're going to talk about the linguistic aspects in just a bit. And he also tells us another thing. Poetry does not have the same standard of correctness, the orthotes, the rightness, the standards, as political science or politics, tes politiques, or other arts besides poetry, right? Ales technes. So what would the examples of that be? Medicine, for example, is a technes, right? Poetry gets a little bit more license because it is poetry, because it's representative here. He says that, and he goes on and he says, there's really two kinds of fault in this art. One we can call intrinsic, about the art, kath hautein, literally about that very kind of art. And the other one we can call, it's sometimes translated as incidental. Accidental would be a little bit closer. Kata sumbebekos. And this is something that is a concept or term that gets used a lot in Aristotle's work, both in ethical context and in metaphysical or epistemological context. So one thing is really about how we're doing poetry, and the other thing is just how things happen to fall out, right? So he goes on and he says, here's an example. If the poet chooses to represent but fails through incapacity, the fault lies in their art. But if the choice is not correct, but for example shows a horse with both right legs thrown forward, which if you know horses, that's not how they run, or a technical mistake, for example in medicine or any other art, then the fault is not intrinsic, it's rather accidental. And he says, okay, so this gives you some raw material for examining and resolving criticisms that get made in problems. So he's going to talk about problems that involve the art itself. And this would seem to be all about the kath hautein, the intrinsic, right? So he'll talk about impossibilities, things that cannot actually be, adunata. And, what are things that are impossible? Well, let's start with some examples that Aristotle doesn't use, but think about cartoons. And think about Bugs Bunny, for example. Can a rabbit actually stand on its two legs, wear clothing, carry on rational discourse, pull tricks on people, including dressing in drag and putting his finger into the gun that a hunter is going to kill him with, or, Yosemite Sam? No, those are all impossibilities. As a matter of fact, a lot of the things that we depict are quite literally impossibilities or highly improbable, right? So he says, if a poem contains impossibilities, well, that seems to be a problem, a fault, a hamartia, a flaw, right? But impossibilities could be okay if the poetry actually attains its goal. And what is its goal? Well, to depict something that is, at least in the case of tragedy, elevated, that helps to produce emotions in us, all these sorts of things. And so he says, if it makes this or some other part of the work more thrilling. Now, Aristotle does actually give us an example. And the example is in the Iliad, the pursuit of Hector, right? It is dramatically thrilling. And so it gets a pass, right? You would be kind of a stick in the mud if you're the person who's going to a movie, for example, and say, that's not realistic. We've all known, or perhaps even been that person. Aristotle says, okay, if the goal could be achieved better without infringing on the relevant art, well, then it does matter, right? You want to have as few faults or no faults if possible. But, if it gets something good done, that can be helpful. And we can also ask, is the fault in the realm of the poetry, the poetic art, or is it something incidental or accidental? He says that it's less serious not to know that a female deer has no horns. So, think about the depiction of deers. Actually, you could also say it's not surprising if you don't know that male deer don't have their horns the entire year around if you're living in a city, right? As a matter of fact, some people have no idea where their food comes from. So he says that it's less serious to not know that a female deer has no horns than to depict one unconvincingly in a way that doesn't do justice to the deer. And here he's talking more about, painting or sculpture, but, we could say this about how people are portrayed or events are portrayed in poetry. Does Homer really know that much about warfare? Maybe not, right? So that's a consideration. We can also ask, if something is false and somebody's going to criticize them, we can ask, well, is it the way it ought to be? just as Sophocles said he created characters as they ought to be. Actually, even Thucydides, the historian, who Aristotle's not mentioning here, will say, these speeches are not verbatim. They're the sorts of things that these people likely said, should have said, right? So that's an important consideration there. He says that Sophocles created characters as they ought to be, Euripides as they really are. And then Aristotle goes on and suggests there's also the principle that people do say these sorts of things. And it's very interesting here. He uses the example of, it's translated here as religion, but we should think about less activities and more beliefs about the gods, right? So what do people say about the gods? All sorts of things that philosophers consider to be off base. He says that maybe it's neither ideal nor true to say such things, but maybe it is as Xenophanes thought, namely that most people are off base when it comes to the gods. That's fine. People do say them. So if in the tragedy somebody is saying, I don't want to do this because Hera or Zeus or Artemis or Apollo will punish me, and Xenophanes would have said, you idiot, there's no such thing as those gods. Well, people do talk about them. So, in a tragedy, that could be just fine. He also, gives you some interesting linguistic examples, but we're going to come to that in just a bit. And then he's got this great consideration. He says, when the question is whether or not someone has spoken well, right? Kalos, me kalos, nobly or not well, or not nobly. Retai tini, spoken. Pepraktai, done things well or not well. Then we should not just examine whether the actual deed or utterance is good or bad, but we should think about a number of other factors. He goes on to rattle these off. The identity of the agent or the speaker, to whom he acted or spoke, when, with what means, for what end, was it to occasion greater good or to avert greater evil? These are things that help to specify. You might say, well, how does that help you resolve problems involving the art itself? It gives you a better understanding of what this person is doing. And you could criticize, saying, this is not well set up. The writer didn't think these things through properly. He goes on and talks about some matters of language, or it's translated as diction, lexis. Now remember that lexis is one of the key elements in tragedy, but also of epic, as Aristotle has just said a little bit earlier. So there's a number of problems that arise because of the language that gets used. He says that the use of a loan word in first against the ures, right? Perhaps he doesn't mean the mules, but the guards. So in tragedy, in epic, one way that you add some gravitas to what you're doing is to use fancy loan words that you wouldn't use in ordinary diction. And so that is what he's talking about there. He's got a couple other cool examples with Dolon, who in form was poor. So form is eidos there. Does this mean that he was an ugly person or misshapen? Well, it depends on what we're looking at. So he says the Cretans call facial beauty euedes. Mix it stronger may not imply neat wine for toppers, right? So the Greeks like to mix their wine with water, but mixing faster. So that's one way to address issues like that. Then we have the use of metaphor, very important in both poetics and also in rhetoric, because Aristotle talks about lexis and metaphor in Book 3 there. So he says that, saying all gods and men slept through the night, and at the same time saying whenever he gazed at the Trojan plain, he marveled at the din of reed pipes and pan pipes. All has been said metaphorically for many. He didn't literally mean all, he just was using it to convey something. All is a kind of multiplicity. Alone without a share is metaphorical. Alone here means best known. Accentuation, it can be like that. And then he also talks about something very interesting, clarifying punctuation. You might say, well, wait a second. Why do we have to worry about that? Well, there's two reasons. One is, even in contemporary English, sometimes people don't punctuate properly, and it changes the meaning of an entire sentence or even paragraph, right? The other thing is, a lot of ancient Greek texts didn't actually have punctuation in them, and it was up to you, the reader, to supply the punctuation. Sometimes you didn't even know where the words began and ended. So, that's a pretty important consideration. We might say, that's not so important, but, it could be quite important. Ambiguity, amphibolia, is another key issue. He says, in more of the night has passed, more is ambiguous. What do you actually mean by it? Ambiguous means that terms can be interpreted in multiple ways, perhaps all of which could be legitimate, but one of which actually applies properly in this case. So he's going to, say when a sense of a word seems to entail a contradiction, consider how many different senses or meanings it could have in the context, right? So, and then we got to pick the one that actually makes the most sense, while perhaps also enjoying the ambiguity that is happening there, right? So we've got all these different linguistic ways in which perhaps the reader, the hearer could go wrong, but we can address these. Or perhaps we can't. Maybe somebody's just bad with words. Then he talks about other criticisms that could be raised. And there's a summary of these at the end where he says, people make criticisms of 5 types. Now, this is not pertaining to the linguistic criticisms, you're being unclear, but to other things that are closer to the nature of the art. It says that things are impossible, right? So adunata, not able to occur, or irrational, aloga, they don't make sense, or harmful. Now that's an interesting one. Blabra, damaging to people. Contradictory, hupanantia. Opposed is another way we could translate that. It's not necessarily logical contradiction in the way that we think about it, but a sort of broader sense there. Or, now notice this, contrary to artistic standards, and the term that he's using there, para ten orthoteta takata technein. So we see this term again, orthotes, right? Orthoteta is the accusative there. So against the standards, which we saw were looser standards, but they're still standards, right? There are standards of the techne of poesis, of poetry, of engaging in mimetic artwork representation, however we want to frame it. So all of those are things for which a play could be criticized. And Aristotle is going to give us some suggestions about how to resolve these sorts of things. So he's going to tell us that, here we go, impossibility should be referred to, it's being translated here as poetic needs, right? Poiesein, what is actually needed by the poetry, or to the ideal, literally the better, the beltion, or to popular belief, what it is that ordinary people tend to think, tein doxein, right? So what does that mean to refer it? We say, okay, this makes sense because of that. So he says, it may be impossible that people should be as Zeuxis painted them. So think of Zeuxis as like painting people with attributes they don't have. Perhaps a guy is bald, but he's got some hair in Zeuxis' painting, or he's a big fat, slug, and he's painted with giant muscles or something along those lines. And he says, but that's an ideal, right? A paragon should be of higher stature. Refer irrationality as the things that are alogon, that don't make sense, to what people say. People do say all sorts of goofy things all the time, don't they? So that's fine. And sometimes they're not actually irrational. He says it's probable that improbable things occur once in a while. And then here's something really interesting. Contradictions should be examined, he says. Now, this is if somebody's criticizing a poem for having contradictions. Contradictions should be scrutinized as with refutations, elenches, in argument, to see whether it's a really good refutation. Is the same thing being meant in the same relation and in the same respect, so that the poet is indeed contradicting his own words, or what an intelligent person would assume? Or is that not actually the case? It's very easy to accuse somebody of engaging in contradiction when they're not actually doing so. And then he talks about another thing that I think is really interesting. Criticizing irrationality, and it's translated here as depravity or wickedness, poneria, right? So also moktheria, weakness, vice is another way of translating it. When you're criticizing a play or an epic for having characters who are bad or are doing things that don't really add up, we can ask ourselves, does it serve a purpose? If they're unnecessary, right, not having ananke, necessity, or if they're not actually doing anything, they're not useful, methen chresetai, well, then we can say that there's a problem there, right? And he gives some examples. Menelaus and Orestes, Aegeus and Euripides, right? Those could be some legitimate criticisms, but a lot of the time, the people that we're depicting, so think about bad guys in TV shows and movies. We can say, they're really doing foolish things. Don't they understand that this is bad for them? It's destroying their relationships. Yeah, but they're the bad guy. That's what they're there for in the story. So that wickedness or foolishness or not thinking things through, it really does need to be there in the story for the larger story to actually work. So these are a number of interesting problems, along with advice for how to resolve these problems, that are provided in Aristotle's Poetics.